Okay, so the new GPUs in the M1 Pro and the M1 Max are pretty awesome, but I really wanted to test the claims that Apple made in comparison to other high-powered, dedicated graphics cards. And this really isn't the easiest thing to do because it's hard to track performance natively across macOS versus Windows, but there is one game that we can use that will be fair as it is native on M1, and that is Baldur's Gate 3. However, we still have another problem, and that problem is macOS doesn't really have a good FPS tracker. You can use the Steam overlay on macOS games, but only if they're using Rosetta 2 to translate the game. On a native M1 game, that overlay is not going to work in Steam. However, we do have the Xcode debug tool, Quartz, that will work showing an FPS meter with games that are compatible with Metal. And that will work great, as long as the frames per second aren't over 90. Because it can only track frames per second up to 90 FPS. After that, the meter just gets stuck and won't go any further. So I finally came up with a solution, and it was actually right in front of my eyes the whole time. So behind me, I have my portable external monitor from Asus, and it's a 17-inch monitor. It will do 240 hertz, and it actually has a built-in frames per second meter. So because it's a variable refresh rate monitor, we can plug it into our MacBook Pro over a USB-C Thunderbolt cable, and it will allow for that variable refresh rate to transfer over. And using that, we can turn on the built-in FPS meter on the monitor, and it will actually show us exactly how many frames per second we're getting in whatever's running on the screen. So for today's comparison, we are going to be putting up the M1 16-inch Max variant with 32 gigabytes of RAM, 32 GPU cores against a full fat 3070 140 watt variant in the Alienware X17. Now I know it's not a 3080, but this 3070 is incredibly powerful. It's paired with the i7 11800H, and together they create a very high power device. So we might get roughly 10 to 15% less performance than a 3080, especially at the higher end in 4K or 1440p, as it only has 8 gigabytes of VRAM versus the 1080's 16 gigabytes of VRAM. Now for today's test, I can only test the Alienware X17 internally, as I don't have an external monitor that goes higher than 1080p. So unfortunately, this test will only be able to do 1080p versus 1080p, but we will do 1440p and 4K on the MacBooks just to show you what kind of performance you can get at those resolutions. But hopefully this can be a relatively fair comparison, as we have a native M1 game versus native on the Windows platform, and we'll see how it goes. And one last thing before we get into the performance overview. So Baldur's Gate 3 has had patch 6 release, but it is not available natively for M1 yet. So we are going to be using patch 6 on the Windows machine, and we are going to be using patch 5 on the M1 Mac. The developers of Baldur's Gate 3 have said that they are holding off on patch 6 for M1 Max because they know what the performance can be like, and they want to make sure that they nail it before they release that patch. So we can most likely expect some performance gains when patch 6 does come out. So that is exciting. But for now, we are on patch 5, and we will be testing with that. So I have never played Baldur's Gate 3 before, so I'm in the starting area. There's actually a lot of particle fire effects going on, and the X17 is performing pretty well. We're getting between 85 and 100 frames per second. It looks great. It's very smooth. There's no hiccups, there's no holdups. It's just running very smoothly, to be expected from a 140 watt 3070 and an i7. And the textures in this game are really impressive. They're very high detail, and they're running very well. Now this cutscene is probably one of the only major slowdowns that we've had, and it's hard to even call slowdown because it's still getting 60, 60 to 70, but it's not the 90 to 100 that we're used to in the beginning of this game. And finally, we're at this last spot. There's a lot of fire on screen. We're looking out at the back at the fire, and we're getting about 50 to 55 frames per second. So this will be an interesting spot to come and test when we go back on the Mac. Okay, so moving on to the M1 Max, we are testing on an external monitor at 1080p Ultra, same exact settings, and I will put up the basically the averages. These are very rough estimates because I wasn't tracking every single frame, and you can see that this one was like glitching a little bit. It was always flashing 240, which is the max refresh rate, when obviously the game was not running at 240 every other second. So I was just looking at the numbers, basically doing a basic average that we could look at. And it's very interesting. On almost every scenes that we were looking at, the M1 Max had roughly a 10 to 15% gain, except for there was one cutscene where roughly 10 to 15% less performance than the X17. But especially this scene right here, it was just performing so much better, you know, up to 20 frames pretty much on average better. And especially looking at this fire where the X17 was only getting 50 to 55 frames per second, we are getting anywhere from in the 70s all the way up into the 90s. So really interesting tests that we were doing. Tried to make it as controlled as possible for the equipment that we were working with. And now in these next few scenes, we're going to be checking out this game in 1440p and 4K. You can see the Xcode debug tool in the bottom left corner. Unfortunately, if you go above 90, you can't really tell what FPS you're getting, but that's okay. Generally, we were getting anywhere from 70 to 90 plus frames per second at 1440p Ultra, which is honestly really good. Even at this fire scene, we're doing really good at over 70 frames per second. That is very impressive. And here we're at 4K Ultra settings. Also still very impressive. We're getting roughly 60 frames per second in this starting area, and it's just going to look really good on this 4K screen, roughly 4K screen. But you can also go 4K, turn the settings down slightly, and you would get probably a locked 60 frames per second wherever you're going. This part of the game does look pretty demanding with a lot of fire and stuff, so I'm not sure what the rest of the game looks like, but you could probably get a locked 60 frames at 4K, no problem. So that pretty much wraps up this video. Honestly, I'm very impressed with the performance. It just goes to show you what you can do with a native program on the M1 Max and M1 Pro chip. It's just really impressive. We knew beforehand that programs like this that are native for M1 do run incredibly well. It's really just the software in terms of gaming that is going to hold the M1 Max and M1 Pros back, which is unfortunate. More developers should definitely take their games to make them Apple Silicon native. The performance is definitely there, and there are a lot of gaming capable machines out there now, especially as we move forward in this Apple Silicon process. It could be a lot of fun. That's all I got for you guys today. If you liked the video, make sure to drop a like. If you didn't like it, that's okay. Just make sure to drop a comment what I could do better, what you'd like to see, and that's it. Thanks for watching. Peace.